Welcome to today's live chapter reading of Isabella, Bride of Ohio, American Mail Order Bride by Debra Parmley and Robert Arrow. Chapter 1. September 1890, Lawrence, Massachusetts. Here in America, nothing lasts. Isabella Britta Stolt stood with her four friends Lily, Tabitha, Hope, and Trinity as she glanced around at the other women gathered in the small park on the banks of Merrimack River. The women had gathered to hear what Roberta McDaniel, their former mill manager, had to say. The Brown textile mill on Canal Street had employed every one of them, like her, until the fire a week ago, which had changed everything when the building burned down to the ground. Nothing lasts. Isabella had lost both her parents right before moving to Lawrence, Massachusetts 2 months before, right after arriving at Ellis Island on the boat from Sweden, which brought them to America, along with the illness that had taken her parents' lives. Nothing lasts. Grandmother always said trouble comes in threes. Every time someone grandmother knew went to heaven, she would start counting. But Isabella had no family left to lose. The fire would be 3. She could only pray that it was the last of her troubles. Isabella had dreamed a repeat of the fire last night, after knocking over a candle in the kitchen, which had caught a towel on fire. Such a small fire compared to the events of that night, but it had been enough to bring on the dream. She needed comfort today. She dreamed she was back working in the factory on the 5th floor. The clanging and banging of equipment, which rang throughout the enormous room 24 hours a day, drowned out any sounds coming from outside the factory. Keeping her head down as usual, concentrating on her sewing, and hoping Mr. Brown would not stand near her again, leering and trying to touch her, Isabella brushed back a lock of hair that had fallen down from her Swedish braids, and sewed the next seam. Her father's Bible lay on her lap, and she placed her left hand upon it when she felt Mr. Brown cast his gaze over to her. Her hand pressed against the worn leather as his gaze pressed down upon her, making her feel squeamish. She peered at him beneath lowered lids, not wanting to fully look at the man who appeared to her as if he could have been the devil himself, with his slicked-back hair as black as coal and his pointed Van Dyke beard. Though he wore a suit, and as the owner of the factory was respected in this town, she disliked and distrusted him. His gaze lingered and then shifted as Roberta McDaniel walked up to him. He turned his attention to her and away from Isabella, who was forgotten for now. She returned her attention to her sewing and away from the pot-bellied man in the fancy suit, hoping this was the end of his attention today. With so many women in the factory, why does he keep singling me out? There are nearly 600 people who work here, most of them women, yet his gaze always finds me. She watched as Roberta climbed the steps to the upper room where the manager's office was. Mr. Brown made his way over to Isabella, and her hand found the Bible again. What does he want? It looks as he has something to say to me. Please, God, make him go away and leave me alone. This time her prayer was answered, and soon he mounted the stairs and headed to the manager's office to meet with Roberta. It wasn't long after Mr. Brown and Roberta McDaniel met in the office that Mr. Brown left the building. He paused once more, looking at her with the strangest expression before he turned suddenly and left. Isabella breathed a sigh of relief and pushed her hair back out of her face again. Today the heat in the building was worse than usual, strange for September. The air was stifling and the noise unrelenting. Isabella wished her shift would end soon, a wish which would be granted with the setting of the sun just now past the many windows which lined the factory walls. She worked from just before the sun came up until just after it went down. The only time she saw the sun was through the factory windows, unless it was her day off. The fire had come so suddenly, the heat in the building rising. There had been a crash as windows were broken. Flames spread, licking up the walls like giant tongues of fire as thick smoke rolled across the factory floor. Women started to scream, and rose from their sewing machines en masse to turn and run, trying to find their way out. Isabella grabbed her Bible and ran with them. The first door closest to them, which she and several other women raced towards, was locked tight. Did he mean to lock us in? God knows, she screamed. How will we get out? Lily heard Isabella and hurried to her side. Come, this way, she said. She ran with Lily to another door at the opposite end of the cavernous room, which wasn't locked, and they raced down the stairs among the other women who rushed down the stairs and out of the building into fresh air. Thick smoke was now pouring out of the windows, and machinery crashed through the floors as the flames devoured the wooden planks. The sight of the huge factory filled with flames blazed into Isabella's sight as one she would never forget. "What a horrible accident!" a woman cried. "I hope everyone gets out." "Jag Troy inte det," Isabella said. Lily turned to look at her sharply. "You don't believe it was an accident?" "No, I do not." "Why do you say that?" "Because I saw Mr. Brown leave early, and he gave me the strangest look before he went out the door, which was locked. I'd think he didn't want anyone following him. Not long afterward, the fire began." Lily raised surprised brows. "You think he started it?" "Yes, I do." Isabella nodded. "He is a horrible man. I'm glad you won't have to fend off any more of his advances. But it's best if you don't say any more about Mr. Brown. You don't want to draw his attention." They stood with the other women, watching the factory that was their livelihood burn down. Fire engines hurried to put the flames out, but the flames were too large, and the factory was too far gone to save it. Now Isabella stood at the park near the river bank, remembering the fire and wondering why Roberta McDaniel had called them here today. Roberta was speaking to the ladies about a mail-order bride matchmaker. Isabella turned her attention fully to Roberta. "My sister recently went to Kansas as a mail-order bride, and she's written to me how happy she is with her groom. A matchmaker in Beckman found her future husband for her. I went to see this matchmaker yesterday to find out if she had any other prospective grooms, and she gave me the newest edition of the Groom's Gazette, listing men from all over the United States are looking for brides. She gave me 50 copies, so if you're interested in being a mail-order bride, please come forward." "Yes, I can do this, and when I marry, I will wear Mother's wedding dress." Isabella pictured the beautiful dress packed in her steamer trunk. The ladies began murmuring among themselves. Roberta was passing out copies of the newspaper called the Groom's Gazette, where men from all over the country advertised for wives. "I'll get copies for us," Hope said as she turned to walk towards Roberta. Hope moved to the front of the crowd and took a few copies of the paper from Roberta and moved back to the small huddle of friends. "Here's one for each of us," Hope said as she handed a newspaper to each of them. But Tabitha wouldn't take the paper when Hope held it out to her. "I don't know if I could do this. I'd be scared to death I'd end up with a mean man." Tabitha shook her head again to Hope's offer. "I have enough savings to get me to my cousin's home in Missouri." Isabella noticed Hope biting her lip as if holding back what she wanted to say about Tabitha's relation. Lily opened the newspaper and began reading. Lily, like Isabella, had come from Sweden. She had been in America for 2 years, and when Isabella arrived to take the factory job, Lily had taken her under her wing and become her roommate and confidant. Often Isabella had watched Lily to see what to do next at the factory in 2 weeks since she had taken the job, and now she fell into that pattern again, as if she were following an older sister's lead. Lily was outgoing and outspoken, where Isabella was quiet and shy, still working on confidence in her English-speaking ability. Now she cleared her throat and spoke up. "Father tried to arrange a marriage for me before he decided to bring us to America," Isabella said. "But the boy had another girl in mind. Without Father—" Her words and gaze drifted off as if thinking of him. Then she spoke again, more decisive now. "Father would have had any suitor investigated." She reached for the paper and nodded. "That is what I will do. I will make sure he is a good man before I marry him." "Sign up to be someone's wife, not knowing who this person is? I don't know what to think of the idea," Lily frowned. "What will you all do in the meantime while we wait to hear from these men?" Hope asked. "I should be able to leave right away," Tabitha said. "I'm already packed, and all that remains is to buy my ticket." "There's a family in town that is in need of a housemaid," Isabella said, "but only for 1 month. Their maid just had a baby and she will return. The baker's wife helped me get the job. I start tomorrow. I've always talked my way into finding odds and ends jobs, be it cleaning fish or scrubbing laundry, so I know I can continue to scrape by until I find me a groom to pay my way out of this city," Lily said with a sly smile, looking at her circle of friends. Hope nodded. Hope, you haven't told us what you're going to do while you wait to hear back, Tabitha said. That's because I don't know, Hope replied with a forced joviality. I'm about to have a great adventure, I suppose. Nothing lasts here in America, Isabella said. I haven't even been here a year, and now I must move again, a third time. I don't know what the future holds or what is best, but I pray it will be good and that it will last. Adventures can be full of danger, Hope. I will pray for all of us to be safe and healthy. I'll figure it out, Hope said, waving off their concern. I appreciate it, I really do, but I'll be all right. So how does this work? Do we write to each person? I think you pick a few who might interest you and start with them. Where would you want to live? Is there a man's profession you'd feel comfortable with? I'd like to go somewhere there are more Swedes than here in Massachusetts, and more open country rather than the stifling smell of this factory town, Isabella said in Swedish to Lily. Isabella had only been in America for 3 months, arriving in New York, then traveling to the Boston area to find work. Her time living alone in New York City, waiting on her parents to recover and be released from quarantine, and after they passed, had been overwhelming. Now she longed for the French country air and the quieter feeling of safety in a smaller town. Although Isabella worked diligently to learn English, she lapsed back to her native tongue when stressed. I've heard there are more Swedish settlements in Minnesota, Illinois, or Kansas than here in the Northeast. I wonder what the weather is out west, said Lily in English so the others could understand. Isabella blushed, realizing she'd lapsed once again into speaking only Swedish, which was so easy with Lily. Surely it's not any worse than the northeasters we've experienced last winter. I think I'd prefer to go south if I had a choice, Trinity said. Okay, let's go back to our apartment and pick out who we want to write to. We'll never get husbands standing around here feeling sorry for ourselves, Hope said as she picked up her skirt and started walking across the grassy park. Lily looked around at the women leaving the park or still talking in groups. Isabella, noting this, glanced around and wondered how many of these women Lily would miss. Though Isabella was too new to the factory to have grown close to any but her roommate and their 3 friends, Lily had been there much longer. It is like a painting, such moments, Isabella said, never to come again. These were all good women, though Isabella didn't know them well. Having only worked at the factory for 2 weeks, she knew that much. They were good women who worked hard and only wanted to improve their lives. That feeling came over her again, the nostalgic feeling of loss and impermanence. Here in America, nothing lasts. Moments were to be savored and treasured, for they would not come again. Lily, never one to encourage Isabella's lapses in melancholy brought on by missing her parents, linked her arm into Isabella's as they walked out of the park. Come on, Isabella, it's time us Swedish girls find 2 rich American husbands. Isabella smiled and said, Yes, I am ready.